Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today we're digging into a recipe from 1773, amazing fine sausages. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So I picked this recipe out because we haven't done sausage in quite a while. It's a good, interesting recipe for the amount of ingredients that are in it and the specificity of how much care you have to take with these different items and how they need to be prepared. So it tells us a lot about what their sausage was exactly like and even what the ingredients were like. It also caught my eye as I was thinking about preservation, and this is a short-term preservation technique for the pork that is used in this sausage. It's something that you would probably make up and store for 2, 3, 4 weeks and have it stored in your larder, and you would be using it all throughout. So it's a fairly large recipe as it's shown in the book. So this recipe is from 1773. It's from this wonderful cookbook, The Universal Cook by John Townsend. I know it sounds like I wrote it, but it's not. Apparently not one of my relations, but wonderful cookbook. So our three main ingredients, the first one is pork, and the recipe actually calls for taking pork meat, chopping it fine, and then using your mortar and pestle until you turn it into a paste. Now, obviously today, instead of doing all that work, we just buy ground pork. It's so much easier. So we're gonna start off with ground pork, and we also need an equal amount of suet. And this is beef suet. It's a little bit tricky to come by, but when you get it, it's so useful in so many different kinds of recipes, especially boiled puddings. But it's one of these ingredients that we really need for our sausage, so we have the right amount of fat that's included. So we got suet here. That's again an equal quantity, and the other sort of main ingredient is sage. We need to have a good quantity of sage. I recommend nice fresh sage like the recipe uses. You can also use dried sage, but we got sage here. Now for our spices, we have some of the standard stuff that of course we're gonna see in every recipe like this. It includes salt, it includes pepper. We also have other sweet herbs. So if you've got thyme, if you've got rosemary, it's got lemon zest, which I thought was a nice ingredient. That's always very, very aromatic and wonderful flavor. And of course, like most 18th century recipes, it includes nutmeg, something we probably leave out today, but of course, we're gonna add it. Mix looks good. Everything's kind of broken down and thoroughly mixed together. Now in the recipe, he actually talks about taking this mixture, which you wouldn't all cook up at once. I mean, the recipe starts off with it's like a 12-pound recipe. You wouldn't necessarily cook those all up at once. You would store it. You might store it for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, and you would store it in a storage jar, something possibly like this one, and you would pack it down into the jar, as the directions say, with as little air as possible. You don't want to pack that down tightly. Now, of course, today we would put this in the refrigerator. In the time period, they would store that in your larder or down in your cellar where it was someplace nice and cold. You might even cover this up to keep as air out as much as possible. And then you would take that out when it was ready to be cooked, and then these get rolled up into little sausage shapes. Let's go ahead and form these up into shapes and get them on the fire. Well, these cooked up and they smelled tremendous. Of course, right there on the open fire, and the sausage smells wonderful. Now, we could have made these with beef. We could have put these in skins. Both of that's mentioned right there in the recipe book, but we just cooked them up like this, the most simple and quickest way. Let's find out how they taste. Well, there's the sage is the first thing that pops out on these. And the sage, being fresh sage, I tell you, it's completely different than anything you'd buy in the store. Sage is a common thing that we still put in sausage today, but I'm sure most of it's like dried and the flavor's kind of weird. Fresh sage is just amazing in these. And of course, the salt, the pepper, you know, it goes along with that wonderful pork flavor. The suet in there makes them nice and rich and juicy, and you can still get that lemon flavor coming through, and there's that just that hint of nutmeg. There was actually quite a bit. There were, in that 12 pounds, there were 2 whole nutmegs in that recipe. In fact, out of a lot of 18th century recipes, this one actually tells you most of the quantities to actually put in. You don't have to guess as much. So it's a very good recipe for that. And boy, does it really, really turn out to be a great sausage. This is a great way to preserve meat for short periods of time. If you want another episode where we talk about preserving meat in a very interesting way, check out this potted meat episode.